In this next module, we're going to create a basic online process, and we're going to store that on the BizFlow server, and we're going to design it in such a way that it can be executed, meaning we can publish it and a business user can initiate it from the BizFlow web client and interact with or perform the various steps in the process. At this point, you should be showing your BizFlow training server in the BizFlow Process Studio. And if you've forgotten or you disconnected and you started this module at another point in time, you can simply right-click on the server and connect and enter your login ID and password. And what you should see in your Explorer tree is going to be a project with your name. This was pre-set up for you by a general administrator of the BizFlow system. So it is typical for someone with a general administrator license and authority to create projects in the BizFlow Studio, and designers and others can then interact with or work on those projects. Inside your project, you'll find an application folder that'll be empty, and you'll find a process definition folder that will be empty, and you'll see that there are different project team roles. Different people can have different access to the project, and you have been assigned, you should see your student ID assigned to these various roles. In order to add a process definition to this project, we need to open the process modeling tool. And we can do that by using the icon on the menu, by using File, New, and opening the process definition, or we can also right-click on the folder, the process definition folder, and select New Process. So any number of ways that we can launch the process modeler. And once the modeler is launched, at this point we could begin to design and create our map, or we can go cheat and go open the process that we created earlier and use that as a basis for our automated process. And again, you can follow along with me, or you can watch the entire exercise and then you can follow along in detail using the step-by-step exercise guide. At this point, what we want to do is we want to save this process now to the server so that it's in our definition folder. The way we're going to do that is we're going to click Add to Server. And when we click Add to Server, it asks us to name that process. I want you to name it My First Online Process. You might want to skip the hyphen, and you can put in your name. And we're putting it basically into this definition folder. If you notice now, the name of the process has changed, and now what's going to happen going forward is the process is going to be checked in and out of the server. So now that it's in the project folder, so let's go ahead and close this window, and we can refresh the project. And now when we look in the process definition folder, we see the process. Anyone that logs in to the studio and that has access to this project by becoming one of the project team members and being given access to the project, they'll be able to see this process definition. Now, if two people were to both simultaneously attempt to open that process and make changes to it, that would be very problematic. So what BizFlow does is when I double click now on that process to launch it into the modeler, it will automatically check the process out. So I now have ownership of this process. Once I'm done making any changes to the process, I would then check the model back in so that someone else could potentially act upon or modify this process. So going forward, once a process is saved to the server, we're going to use check in and check out to interact with the process. One thing that is likely occurring in your process map that is not occurring in mine is that your activities likely have a question mark on them. And the reason for that question mark is the preference setting that I mentioned to you a bit earlier. under the Windows Preferences setting in the Process Designer area, remember I indicated that this check mark here is very helpful to have set. By setting it, when I drag an activity from the palette and I drag it into the screen, it automatically sets under participant the initiator as the participant of this activity. Now, the reason you want to do that when you're initially modeling is that you're probably going to be testing this process in its initial forms. And you want to, as the person who's going to start the process, you want to participate in every activity so that you can test it, and so therefore the participant in every activity will automatically be set to initiator until you at some later point change that assignment. And then of course you can assign this to a user group or an individual user or any number of things. You can actually change this participant assignment. But for now, we're going to make it initiator because you didn't have that preference setting set when you originally created your first process. I need you to go in and assign initiator to each of these steps. The way you're going to do that is double click on the activity and you're going to select initiator. So I'll unset this so you can see how it works. So you're going to select initiator and then you're simply going to click and assign the initiator to the activity. And you can see here that now I have the initiator set. So I want you to do that for both of the activities so that they both have initiator. The next thing we want to do in order to make this process actually function or run is we need to put a routing rule or a transition rule on these two paths. Right now, if you were to start this process, what would occur is we would start the first step in the process and we would complete it and it would go to the second step, and at this second step it wouldn't know which path to take because we haven't told it what path to take and how to do that. One of the techniques of routing in BizFlow is called using a response group. In essence, what this is we're basically saying that when the user reaches this activity, we're going to give them a response option, a drop-down menu, basically in the work item handler that says, what do I want this user to be able to do? And if they select approve, it's going to route the process one way, and if they select disapprove, it's going to route it another way. Let's go and look at that in the web client portal so you can see exactly what I mean. This activity is the second step in the process through the web client, and again, so here's our complete travel request and here's our approved travel request activity. And what we see here is when the user opens up the work item from their work list, I'm going to go ahead and redo that. I have this approved travel request, and the user opens up that activity. Up at the top, they have this choose an option to complete, and they have the ability to approve or disapprove this item. This right here is the response group. And how we define and create that response group in the process definition then is to define the response group on that activity. And so we're going to add approval response. This is the group. And then we're going to add each of the possible responses, approve, disapprove. So these are the two possible responses that we can give this user. And you see that the item is checked. This simply says that by default it's going to be approved. So if the person didn't select an option, by default we're going to send it down the approval path, or we're going to use the approval response as the response. Now that we have a response group defined on this activity, we now have to tie it to these two different outflow paths. There's a number of different ways we can do that. We can go to the outflow of the activity and click on each of the paths, or we can simply double click on the path. Either way, it's going to achieve the same objective. And what I want to do now is define a rule to use that response option. So I'm going to say that the condition type is simple, and I'm going to use a response in a given activity to route this work. So I'm going to use the response and select for this activity the manager approves request activity, and what is it, the response that they're giving? Approve, and that then is going to be tied to this path in the process. And I'm going to write that same conditional rule on my disapprove path. So I'm going to select simple as my condition type. I'm going to select response. I'm going to pick manager approval request, which is the activity, and I'm going to say disapprove, and that now is the rule for this path. So what I've done is I've created a very simple routing rule using response options to do that. With now the fact that we've defined participants for the activities, and we've defined a response group to allow us to make the branching decision here in our process, we can pretty much publish and run this process. Now, of course, we haven't linked a form to the steps in the process, but we can test the workflow. So we can actually test to see if this is going to put the activity into the work list correctly, and if it's going to route based on those selections correctly. The last thing we need to do is publish the process, and that we have to take several steps in order to do that. First, if we right-click on the process and we get to the process property, and another way to get to the process property is under the file menu. So you can say file, process property. This is attributes about the overall process. So we've been working on attributes for each activity. This is attributes for the overall process. One of those attributes is the publication status. We need to set the process into a publishable state in order to publish it. So it needs to be publishable. That's the first thing we're going to do. Then we're going to check the process in. So we have to check it back into the server because of the changes that we've made. And it's going to ask us if we want to check it out again. And we can simply say no. At this point, we're done making any changes, and then we can close the model. Now we have to publish the project over to the operation environment. So right now we have a project that's in the studio and it's on the server, but we haven't made it accessible to anyone yet. At this point, I'm going to click on my project, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to select Publish. The publication wizard has two fundamental steps. Step 1 that you see here, it says select the project objects to publish. What do you want to publish from this project? At this point, I want to publish my online process, my first online process. So I'm going to push that over into the objects to publish. And then the next thing I'm going to do is it says where in the operation environment, what folder do you want to publish this to? And this is where authority groups comes into play. So I mentioned authority groups early on as part of the security model of BizFlow. And when you define folders in the operation environment, and right now we have one for the RMA processes, one for Office Engine, and then just a general overall folder, you assign authority to these folders. So it's one way where you can say, maybe I have a finance process folder, and only people in finance are going to be able to initiate that process or see that process or work with that process. That's why we create folders in the process, in the operation environment, and why we apply authority to it. And in this case, we're simply going to use the root process definition folder because we haven't created necessarily a folder for our specific project. And then we're going to click Finish. By doing that, we just published our process to the execution environment, to the operation environment. And if we go to the operation environment now, and we go to process execution and to process definitions, and we double click, again, I told you sometimes the content is shown in these panels. And so in the operation environment, that's more often than not. And we're going to see these are all of the process definitions that are currently published to the training server. And you can see here's my newly published process, and you should see your own process in this list. Now, in order to interact with the process, we want to run the process, we're going to log in to the portal, the web client. And before I log into the web client, it's advisable that you disconnect or log out from the Process Studio. So you can simply right-click and disconnect and connect against the server. And now that you're disconnected from the server, we can log into the web client. And now, under the Start New menu, you should see your process in the process definition list. So here we have our standard processes, and we have my first online process. And I can now view that just like I could view the other processes, and I see the process that I created, and I can start the process. And you can see that this task does not have any applications to complete. Why? Because we didn't link any forms to the activities of the process. But the process will still work. The process will still run, and it will still open up a work item, and it will complete that item and move it to the next step in the flow. We just haven't associated any particular form to this step in the process yet. We can complete that step, and then you can just click send. And now if we go into the My Work, we're going to see the manager approves request in my first online process. And again, we're not going to see any form or any application. And now we're going to see that response option that we created. So we defined a response to approve or disapprove the item. So go ahead and disapprove the item. And you can see that it sends it back to the employee completes request step in the process. And of course, if you go to the My Monitor now, you'll also be able to monitor that process. So you'll be able to see, select Monitor. We can see that the blue indicates that it went to this step. It's currently green, which means it's at that step. The blue indicates this step had occurred and it took the disapproved path. And we can also see clearly in the audit history that that's what's occurred. So that's it. You've just now completed and built your first BizFlow process.